Padding and margins are two CSS attributes that you're going to find yourself tweaking an awful lot to get the layout that you want. So let's talk about what they are. First of all, to understand, every bit of HTML actually has an invisible box around it. When you increase the space between the edge of the content and its box around it, you're increasing the padding. You saw over here when I gave padding of 5 to anything that had the EM tag around it. Do you see how it increased the box size of it? The space that it takes up. All right, so by default, when it didn't have any padding, you can see it's just its box, its space that it takes up is pretty much just the size of those letters. But if I go back up and I add more padding, like 25 pixels of padding, and I look over, now that box, it takes up a much larger space. So it's the space that that tag takes up, the EM tag. And in this case, it's just one word. But if I wanted to expand that and put that over more than one word, so where's our not here? Okay. So I'm going to move this down here. So now it's that whole sentence that has the EM tag, and you can see how it's, so it's not just about that one word, but it's the space that is around all of those words because they all have the EM tag around them. I assigned that padding to the EM tag, so now everything here has this extra space, which doesn't particularly look very good, so I'm just going to do Control Z and get that back. Okay, so padding is the space between the content and the edge of its box, and you can expand that if you wanted to. Between every bit of HTML, between every HTML element, there's also space, and that space is controlled by the margins. So that's what we're going to target. And what we saw when you had a lot of headings in your recipes is there was a lot of default space between your headings and your paragraphs. All right, so when you use HTML, the browsers give default margins to your headings. And if you don't want them, you use CSS to get rid of them. I think I've already mentioned this, but things that are block level, so things that start on a new line, like your headings and your paragraphs, all have this default margin space, versus things that are inline, like the emphasize tag, the I tag, the sub tag, the soup tag, those things, or image tag, they all stay within, and they are not given any default margins. So you don't have to worry about clearing out or getting rid of those default margins. So the way that we're going to do that to get rid of the default spacing is by putting the margins to 0. The margins, in this case, at the bottom of heading 1 and the margin at the top of heading 2 to 0. So back over to Dreamweaver, I'm going to now add a CSS rule for my H1 tag. I'm going to actually put that in between my body and my paragraph tag because I like to keep my tags in order. And the body is generally the first tag because it's for the entire background. Then what is the largest and most noticeable thing at the top of my page? That's my H1. So I put that tag first. So H1, and then go down. And what I'm going to do is put margin, and I'm going to choose the option for margin bottom 0 px semicolon. Okay, when I click over here, I don't see a difference yet, but it is making a difference. This text here, I wanted to go right underneath without having the space. This was my H3. So now I'm going to write a rule for my H3. And this one I'm going to put at margin top 0 px semicolon and click over here. And now they're right next to each other. Go over to my browser where I'm viewing this, and you can see how they are right next to each other. If I took out that margin bottom 0, remember how I said it didn't really look like it was doing anything? If I took that out and I move over here, it bumps down again. So it is actually doing something. We don't see it. But so if you want to have your two headings or a heading and a paragraph right next to each other, then you're going to put the margin for the bottom at 0, and then for the one below, the margin at the top to 0. All right, so what else can we target here? We have our headings, our heading 1, our heading 2. We have a heading 3, so I'm going to actually put that in between so that my headings stay in order. Heading 3, let's just do something different with that one. He says, then I came along and I wanted to be a heading 2. Okay, we could give it a different font family. I'll give it a different font family just because I can. And let's give it a different font color. So that is just color. And just something, I'm going to just pick some kind of color, anything, just to show that I can make this look different from everything else. And then this one here says, I'm a paragraph and I want to be close to the heading. Please don't separate me from my heading. So I think what we're talking about here is also getting rid of that default space here. How could I do that? I could go back to my paragraph. I don't need to write a new rule. I can just keep adding attributes inside my existing rule. So I could go to margin top and put that at 0px. And that brings that up higher as well. Okay, what else could we do here? Next, we have to start targeting the lists. One thing I'd like to do with my list is I'd like to get rid of my bullets. So I need to add a new CSS rule for that one. And what I'm going to target is my LI tag, put my open bracket, and that is going to be list style type. And I'm going to choose none from this list. But if you were interested in switching it to something else besides the bullets, you have a whole list here of other things you could put it as. But I'm going to put it as none. And now I no longer have the bullets. But I would like there to be a little bit more space in between them. So I'm going to add a margin. I'm going to go back inside my list item CSS. And I'm going to put a margin. You may notice when you're looking at margins or paddings that you have a choice of margin, margin bottom, left, right, or top. So if I only wanted a margin on one of those sides, I would just choose that side. If I want to put the same value of margin on all 4 sides, I choose just margin. So I'm going to put margin, and then I'm going to put 10px, which is putting margin. It's adding space around it on the top, the bottom, the left, and the right. And so now when I move over, you can see that it did that. It actually moved over a little bit because it added margin here and on the top and on the bottom. Okay, the last thing on here that we might want to target could be our images. Currently, they're all right next to each other. And as I mentioned before, I could put them all into separate paragraph tags. I could even put them into list, make them a list, and then they would all be on top of each other. Or if I just wanted to move them apart a little bit, I could simply add some padding and margins around them. Okay, so I'm now going to add a tag to target my images. It's the IMG tag, open curly bracket. So I'm going to make a little bit of space around them. I'm going to add some padding on the bottom at 10 pixels. And this won't really be noticeable until I give it a background color. And I'm going to do padding on the left. I'm going to give that 2 pixels, and then padding on the right as well, 2 pixels, and padding on the top, I'll give that 4 pixels just to illustrate using like a different amount for all of them. So when I click over here, I see a little bit of space, but I don't really see much of a difference. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add a background color. And just like when I added the background color to my words that were in the strong tag, you're now going to be able to see it. So a background color, and I can just give it the background color, kind of anything. I'll just pick a dark blue. And now that works a little bit like a border. And if I wanted to separate my images, that would be with the margin. So now I'm going to add a margin, oops, misspelled that, a margin all around of 5px. And click over here, and now you can see how they're all separated out. I'm going to save this and I'll go back over to my browser. I always prefer to look at things in the browser instead of just at Dreamweaver. Okay, now we have some pretty awful designs going on here, but it's really just for the sake of illustrating how the beauty of CSS is you take all of those HTML tags and now you can start tweaking them to have different colors or different fonts, or maybe it's just something as simple as controlling the spacing here. And I noticed that I have still a lot of space between this heading and this paragraph, and I did want to shrink that up. This is a heading 2, so that will be the last thing. Let's just go back and do that. I'm going to go into my H2, and I'm going to put a margin on the bottom of 0px. And I think my paragraph already has a margin on the top of 0, so yes. So now those guys are right next to each other. Okay. All right, so I am going to put out like a little CSS cheat sheet with some of the things that I think are the most common CSS that you'd be looking at working with right now, and that I'd like you to be practicing for your next homework assignment.